Hello! Welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, Quayd, and Wsdtime. And today we're going to talk about determinism from the perspective of the self. What does it mean for us as individuals once we understand determinism and that there are causes for our behaviors? Because Quaid was saying before we started that we think of it in terms of analyzing other people, but do we ever look in the mirror, so to speak, at what makes us do what we do? So that's the general idea you meant, right, Quaid?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, so do you guys have this experience where you do things, but you either think you know why you're doing something or you're not sure and you're trying to figure it out?
Well, Chandler, one way I use this knowledge is like, for example, I try to learn about politics. I try to somewhat get political before elections, and it's like, there's always an opposing party, and like years ago, I used to kind of like be very emotional. I used to like not like people. I used to have strong emotions toward what people said and directed those emotions to them. And one great benefit of getting that nobody has a free will is that it gives me a powerful reason to let go of these negative, unpleasant emotions and judgments. You know, as a result of this, fine, I may not like what certain politicians say, what certain people say, their ideologies, their viewpoints, their proposals, but just not being able to any longer rationally hold them responsible is really a gift. It just like frees me from this anger toward them and these negative feelings.
So, George, what you're saying is the hostility you felt towards certain politicians or political views that were different from your own, a lot of that anger went away as you realized people were not to blame for what they did, even if you found it appalling.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, with me, like I'm not as not that political, obviously, as you know, but when it comes to the morality of issues, I've had a similar
Full
experience.
Bernie.
What's that, Will?
Full Bernie.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it really does help when we're not really blaming people because they know it wasn't up to them, that they didn't really choose their opinions on a matter. Instead, the way I look at it now is, you know, which of two positions on an issue, whether it's a political issue or a moral issue, or or arguments for or against some scientific or philosophical something, whatever it may be. I just look and see which has merit, which makes the most sense, and it's easier to do that when you're not just getting all emotional and mad, like George was talking about.
Right,
Yeah, yeah.
Quaid. Yeah,
Oh
Quaid.
yeah, I agree.
You brought up the topic today. So how how does it affect your life on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like what you said, and that's an important component too. And I was like, I kind of like to take that a little bit further. I mean, in the same way that you're saying, it kind of alleviates the anger that you feel towards other people. For me, I found that it also alleviates the disappointment in myself, when I do something wrong personally. It doesn't mean that I don't feel bad about mistakes because I think that's just kind of like a natural part of it. But I think that people can linger on it way too long. They beat themselves up because they feel like, well, I did this. This is my personal choice, and it's not connected to anything. And so I think there's also an internal blame in the same way that we end up blaming other people. We actually end up doing the same thing to ourselves, and that can be harmful as well because it makes it hard to get past um, certain things that you're trying to fix. You just end up feeling bad about them and not actually fixing them.
Absolutely. Not only does
Yeah.
it distract us from addressing whatever needs to be addressed, like you were saying, it adds this unnecessary mistaken element of self-punishment. We're punishing ourselves for things that really weren't up to us. So to the extent we can overcome that, our quality of life is definitely going to be enhanced.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that it seems that when people are blaming themselves, feeling like they're bad because they chose to do something, well, then it leads to them trying to justify what they did, you know? And yet, here's what I find particularly interesting. Every reason somebody uses to justify, well, I had to do this because they were doing that, and all this stuff. And what you realize is that they're describing, sort of the mitigating circumstances that explain why they did what they did. And what I think is particularly interesting, like I draw a line between they had to do what they did because X Y Z, and it's the right thing to do, because there's a difference. There's a difference between what's right or wrong, good or bad, and what someone had to do. Because everything we did, we had to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And also, like,
Yeah,
it
like paying
presents,
your bills.
yeah, it presents challenges because, for example, let's say somebody in your life does something wrong toward you, right? Offends you in some way. um, Fine, okay, you don't blame them. You don't like direct your hostility toward them, but for example, take the case of like self-defense. If somebody came at you physically, then I think you have a moral obligation to defend yourself. And so if
Hmm.
it's something that it's not physical, but somebody did something, harmful to you, then fine, we don't blame the person. But then the question becomes, and again, we can do it easier without the free will belief because it just removes that element of emotion. But sometimes we still have to kind of like, quote unquote, punish the person. Let's say somebody let's say somebody's supposed to like be at a certain place at a certain time and they're continually showing up late, making you wait and stuff. So in other words,
Hmm.
like this perspective that nobody has a free will, it does free us from a lot of negative emotions, but it doesn't, solve everything. We still have to negotiate things in terms of like, you know, defending morality, defending our certain rights, whatever, our welfare, and molding other people to kind of like to behave in ways that are more acceptable. And that again, that's a challenge that's apart from this free will. It's a challenge that remains, regardless of whether we believe we have a free will or not.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that by saying that another problem is that everybody has a different idea of what behavior is acceptable or not. So we're still stuck with a war of competing ideas and beliefs about, different people want society to be a certain thing, and they're not all going to just magically agree just because they understand that they didn't choose their opinions. I mean, in fact, that's part of the deal is since we don't choose our opinions, we can't just all magically agree all of a sudden. And for some, that might be an inconvenient thought, yet it's true.
Yeah, yeah. I think it then it goes back to I mean, it's, like you said, nobody really kind of chooses their um or they don't have free reign over their opinion, so it makes it a lot harder to convince people. But that's I guess just part of it is trying to educate people on certain things. Because I mean, the thing is, like, and this is something that a lot of uh liberal people sometimes do, is they take this subjective stance, like there's no such thing as the objective, so to speak, which may or may not true, but for some people that ends up boiling down to there is no right or wrong, and you can't assert a position to be right or wrong, otherwise you're just an imperialist, or you're just trying to dominate other people's minds by saying that there are right and wrong actions.
And see, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Quaid, because a lot of people they have a way of saying there's no moral responsibility by saying there's no morality, that there's no objective standard of right and wrong, therefore no one's morally responsible because nothing is moral or immoral. And yet, I would say we don't have to do that. We don't have to go the route of moral relativism in order to eliminate moral responsibility, because determinism and or indeterminism, if it was somehow known, would also make moral responsibility non-existent. But the question about morality, this whole subjective morality thing, what's interesting about it is to me it's sort of like like objectively, music is a bunch of sounds, right? It's a bunch of sound waves, and we hear it, and yet people make certain judgments of like, oh well, this song is better than this song, or this movie is better than this movie. People do this like, well, this is better than that, and so that's where it's like we can't say that the music doesn't exist or the movies don't exist just because people have differing opinions over them, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I think also like, not just liberals. I think, many of us are atheists on this podcast. And yeah, this idea that, that I mean, what we try to bring across in these podcasts is like that yes, morality exists. And, I personally believe there is an objective morality, but as Chandler, as you were just pointing out just now, what that objective morality is sometimes is relatively clear to see. Sometimes it's not. It's kind of like hazy. But the other part is that that basically, fine, we have a morality, and the thing is, it's not our morality. In other words, like, because we don't have a free will, doesn't it means we don't have we're not personally to blame for the morality. And here's actually, Quaid, where we there's an area of contention in a certain sense between like those of us who are atheists, those of us who are theists. In other words, like if there is a morality, if there's a right and wrong, an objective right and wrong, regardless, that it's not ours because we don't have free will, then who or what do we assign it to, or do we just like not assign it to anything? You know,
Yeah.
Here's an interesting idea, George. Morality can't be assigned to God because if God can just create morality, then it becomes subjective at the whim of God, which it's sort of yeah. So one way to look at it is morality is God. If someone wanted to go strange with that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm more equate everything to goals. I mean, I cannot tell somebody, to me, I cannot, somebody who thinks that the purpose of humanity is, let's say it's survival of the fittest. So just some people gotta go, like if somebody asserts that position, there is no scientific test I can do to tell that person that they're wrong. But the second that we say we care about if we develop the same fundamental basis, which a lot of people do, of morality, which is the well-being of humans as a whole, with to create progress in the world and make sure there's less suffering. I mean, once you accept that as your premise, there are scientific things you can do to say there are conversations that you can have logically with that person to tell them this thing would not work if your goal is to better humanity. But so to me, morality in some ways is subjective. But I think once you're on solid footing, or once you're on the same ground as somebody else, that's where you can have the logical conversation about objectivity and what's objectively true in achieving certain goals in humanity.
I like what you said there, Quaid, because to even have a discussion about morality or to have a scientific method for investigating such a thing, there has to be an agreement among people about what the goal is. Because if one person's trying to play tennis and another person's trying to play basketball, they're not playing the same game, so there's no discussion.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you can't talk about what the rules are. You can't talk about if this person really did foul or something, because you're playing different sports. So the sport will dictate what a foul is, in the same way that where you're starting morally will dictate what is a right or wrong moral action. If the moral basis of if the basis of your morality is that it's okay to kill humans, or that it's okay to kill an innocent human who is not doing any harm, then committing a crime is not immoral to that person because they're following out what they believe is true about the universe.
all right. So wait a minute. In your personal experience, would you say, how would you say like overcoming the belief in free will basically makes this process of determining right from wrong and communicating this easier? In other words, how does the belief in free will interfere with that process?
Yeah, I think like I said earlier, I think a lot of us start off fundamentally that a lot of us do that we want people to have that we want more well-being in the world. Okay, like if you ask most people, that's going to be the foundation of their morality is they want the better world. And so once you have that platform, then free will starts to mess with things within the reality of that morality. I mean, once people start there, so if you think if we all start there that we want things to increase the well-being, really, if we're determinists, we immediately start to look at the components of what makes somebody less happy or what diminishes well-being, and then once you start to get the kind of choice aspect, if people will say, well, people's choices decide that. If you just believe somebody makes their choices by this weird thing that people call free will that we're still not sure what it is, then you can't problem solve at that point. It's a problem solving stopper. There's nothing you can do because you're just basically admitting that their actions are not entwined in any other circumstances that we can change. So that's how it messes with that.
You're absolutely right, Quaid. And see, for a lot of people, that really is a conversation stopper because when people just say something's a matter of personal choice, then they don't like to be questioned on why they did something. It's like, oh, it's a personal choice. Like there is no cause. It's like I did it. It's my
Yeah.
choice. And here's what's particularly interesting about it is we can never say something is really our choice. Really. I mean, when we understand that it really is just a bunch of luck, it's like a Monopoly game. We don't choose where we land, where the die rolls. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I guess because I'm a person who values questioning everything, this explains how I don't like the belief in free will because it stops people from asking those deeper questions. And if they don't ask the deeper questions, then there's nothing to talk about. There's no way of relating to anyone. And it's only through getting into these deep philosophical, scientific, and sometimes religious debates that gives me a reason to talk at all.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm thinking like in my life, also this relates to our future, our plans. I mean, like, have you guys found, like, for example, like if I'm planning something, planning to do something, thinking about doing something, a project or something, and if I'm kind of like holding this belief in free will, it may feel more intimidating. It's kind of like it presents the possibility of failure, or personal failure, and
Yeah.
then this indictment. So yeah, so this overcoming, evolving beyond free will belief, I think would encourage more courageous planning. Just
Yep.
invite more opportunities.
Oh yeah, yeah. And that goes back to, I mean, there's really like there's a wealth of conversations to be had here. I mean, if you think about being in a classroom, like personally, being a teacher, like when I want students to explore possibilities, it becomes really hard because of this thing called error or this being wrong thing. It makes students less likely to come out and share their opinions because they're so afraid of being wrong. And I think that the reason they're afraid
Or
of
too
being wrong.
embarrassed.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that embarrassment comes from the fact that they don't think people will sympathize with them if they're wrong. They won't be seen as a human being who makes errors. It'll be attached to them in some negative way, as if they're choosing to just be ignorant about something, instead of just making an error, which is natural for determined beings. It's sometimes the randomness of the universe, it culminates in what we call an error, and instead of just kind of viewing it as that way and allowing all the chips to be on the table, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves and we restrict ourselves in a lot of ways so that way it doesn't come out.
Yeah, well, that brings up a very interesting question. I mean, doesn't the idea, the belief in free will, imply that there are no mistakes, no accidents, but that each person somehow intentionally chose to make those mistakes?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really hard to have the conversation because I mean, I've read a lot of books on free will, and I still don't know what it is. I can't logically connect. I think Sam Harris said it best. Like it's a really hard philosophy to map onto reality. I think that's the best way to look at it.
For me, it
Yeah.
just well, for me, it's just something that was always taught, and I never understood it. I just went along with it.
A lot of people do.
And then the question becomes, so, all right, so we've got this experience of understanding the reality, reality the way it is. And I mean, beyond the question of, we have to ask ourselves, how do these, like, college professors, these educated people who are ostensibly, intelligent, how do they not
Hmm.
understand this? And
Yeah.
along with that, you know, I think we have the personal experience of trying to figure out, because I think they're basically, rejecting the truth in favor of what makes them feel good. I think, basically, like, they like to feel authorship. They like to believe that everything isn't already mapped out, already destined. That makes them feel good. So, like, our challenge becomes like, fine, we get this on a personal level in our personal experience. How do we explain this to people to overcome
Hmm.
that barrier? It's not a logical, you know, part of them that is preventing them from understanding this.
Yeah, yeah. I really don't. I mean, but it's. I mean, the same thing could be asked. I mean, the problem with this question is, I mean, there's I like people wonder how certain scientists can be so religiously devout, or how scientists there are scientists who believe that the Earth is flat and that we didn't land on the moon, and the list goes on and on. So I think it's just again that there's concepts that just once you get outside of that experts area of expertise, there's nothing holding them down. I would like to think that um, they would kind of apply, they would really just stick to their field and have a conversation about what their field says, but that's just not what they do, and they come out and they're not necessarily, maybe they haven't thought about it, maybe they just haven't thought about free will. I'd be interested to like have a conversation fully with somebody like Daniel Dennett. I mean, I've watched a lot of his videos, and he seems to wrap up or kind of mystify his position in a lot of like jargon, or it becomes semantics in some ways. Um, but he's thought about it. He's thought about it a lot. So I do wonder where some of that is coming from. Some of them.
Yeah, because if you're in the process of writing a novel about this issue, I think, that's one of your major challenges. Basically, like, certainly you want to present the logic of it, right? But then we have to acknowledge, again, like with Dennett, with a lot of academics, people who should get this, it isn't really that complicated, that difficult, don't. What do you say to them? Like, part of this, maybe we need to investigate people who have changed their view, who once strongly believed in free will and now understand it. But that's the challenge. Fine, we have to acknowledge that in academia you have this, not just in this field, but with climate change and various other issues. And I think maybe in the it may be different answers for different issues. In other words, like the message for to get scientists on board on climate change may be vastly different than the message to get them on board on for this free will thing. So it's kind of
Mm.
a unique challenge we face.
Yeah, I think the deal with people who, are smart people, but they don't understand that free will is nonsense, is that they haven't yet found the right cause that changes their mind. And it depends on the person what sort of reasoning, what sort of arguments, or what experiences will help explain it to them in a way they can understand it.
Yeah, and the problem is probably you can't typify the problem because it's going to be different for different people. One of the things I would say would be the definition of free will. I think there's a lot of confusion about even among people who believe in free will what they believe about free will. If you ask somebody like Daniel Dennett what he thinks about free will, and you sit down and you allow him to explain it in full, it sounds nothing like the free will that is talked about in churches among religiously devout Christians. It's not the same. It's more nuanced. It still doesn't. I still don't think it's right, or I don't still don't think it makes much sense in reality. But their reasons right there. The reason between their confusion, uh, or what Daniel Dennett might miss is that they just don't have the same definition of it. So some people it's going to be a matter of definition.
But Quaid, I think that's a symptom. In other words, I think they're changing the definition as a way to defend it.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so again, and I've led like dozens and dozens of discussions, meetup groups on this, and you get people, I think, if we really thought about it, there are probably 1 dozen or perhaps 2 dozen at most basic reasons why people, you know, can't accept this. Like one that comes to mind, from an actual conversation I had. You got to understand, like, 80 to 90% of people, at least here in America, are spiritual in the sense that they believe in God or a higher power, right? So,
yeah,
so I'm explaining to this woman, like, why we don't have a free will. She's getting it, but she happens to be religious. And then it dawns on her, wait a minute, that means that God is not just all good, God is also evil, and God is responsible for all these atrocities that, historical atrocities. And that, I mean, that's a powerful, kind of obstacle that we have to challenge somehow. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yep, and that's a long story itself. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I was talking about with Chandler at one point, I think last Saturday. But it's I mean, look what's what happening look at what is happening right now with the Catholic Church and what has happened. Uh they're not the same. They don't look like the Catholic Church, 500 years ago because they're constantly reforming. There's reformations, and then you have kind of a church that accepts evolution and is now starting to be more accepting of gay people. And it's probably going to be something like that. I don't imagine that the concept of a deity is going to go away, but maybe it'll look something like we were talking about before, like I think it was the Puritans. They were deterministic. They still thought that people were going to hell or that you were just destined for hell, which is kind of messed up. But if we can get past the kind of the uh, the bad moral parts of the old determinism with religion, the new one might be more forgiving. Like if you take Jesus, when Jesus says they know not what they do, that would be a centerpiece for a deterministic philosophy. People don't know what they're doing, and you can't blame them for it. Like that. You could take that and you could develop some type of still what we would identify as Christian religion, but still straying away from the free will nonsense.
Yeah, it's very interesting how religion, just like society in general, changes over time so that it's nothing like what it was a few hundred years ago. And this I find very fascinating because it seems more like rather than to just say, oh, this thing doesn't exist, people have a tendency to define it. And for example, I've sort of done this in a way because, when talking about the self, like, sure, in one sense, I understand the self to be an illusion. Like, and I mean, like, no persistent self that is a me that stays the same and that survives death. But in everyday speech, people use self to refer to their brain, body, thoughts, experiences. We still have like the idea in language of there's you, there's me, but it does depend on the definition. And I think what happens is I've taken like a sort of compatibilist way about the self, like, well, self just means, my body, this body that people label Chandler Klebs, but that's all it is, and I'm not claiming more than that. So, like, and here's the question, guys, is when do we how do we actually know, like, when to take a compatibilist approach and redefine things, or whether to just say, "Oh, this is just absolute non-existent. It makes no sense." It's really tough to know.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is context. For example, like um, most technically, nobody ever quote unquote chooses anything, because everything's been predetermined. But we use the word choice, pragmatically. You know, we're gonna like we go out to dinner, we're gonna choose between different entrees or different drinks, whatever. So yeah, we have to kind of like I think that might be the and like the English language just does that a lot. With a lot of other different words. With a certain context, the meaning is understood. With a different context, people understand the same word, in a different way. Um, so yeah, that's. But Quaid, are we directly enough addressing the point we started out with how this is playing out? Because I know we're becoming
The
like a bit more philosophical in terms of like converting and yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know. We did kind of switch there. Well, just to real quick, kind of talk a little bit about each. I'll go back to the main topic, but I think it's interesting that if you read proponents of free will, like um, Alfred Melee or Robert Kane or Daniel Dennett, a lot of like Daniel Dennett has a book called Elbow Room, and that's what it's called. And if the language that's used around free will is, well, how do we adapt it or how do we make it fit? Rather than is this something we need? The conversation is, can we keep it? Almost, instead of is this something we can actually validate as the reality of experience, while not attaching it to, because I mean that's I think we talked about this before, like it's just to me attached to way too many things uh, in the past that it's worth using because the general population is always going to misunderstand. If you want to define it as like well educated, why can't we just call you well educated? Or if we mean that you weren't coerced by somebody to commit an action, why can't we just say this person is non-coerced? But the second you want to put free and will together, people start to drudge up these old ideas about spirituality and uh, basically what it creates myopia. We start looking at it in a very closed and limited microscope. We don't take in the bigger picture. We start to look at the individual and not the things surrounding the individual. And so, I mean, that's the bottom line of that for me. But yeah, as far as the self goes, the reason that I brought this up and that it was interesting to me was because I like a couple of you on here. I used to be fundamentalist Christian. I used to believe in free will pretty heavily, and then I think I said this before. It just made it really easier for me when I stopped blaming myself about things and I started to ask why I was committing certain acts. And because to me, I think that a lot of people are just driven by will. So like if you want to lose weight, you will yourself to do it. You just need to make the right choices. You don't need to ask like, well, why am I eating wrong? Am I stressed out? What about my workout routine isn't getting me interested? And you stop engaging, if that makes any sense.
All right, Quaid, what's interesting, so like, all right, so you it's interesting when was it that you kind of like realized that free will was an illusion, and what was it about it? I mean, what how did it ultimately not make sense? Because like to your experience, if we can understand how you did it, and Chandler, I think
Yeah.
you've explained in the past how you've done it, then we can better understand how to approach people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, it was sociology class. That's what really did it for me. I remember it was a slow transition, so I stopped being Christian probably 5 years ago. That's when me and my wife got married. Um, and then shortly after that I was taking sociology classes, and somewhere along the line I'm like, how is it that there is this huge, I mean, it's one of the things that I use, it's such a strong correlation. Why is there such a strong correlation between obesity and your income? Like, why is that there? In a world where people are making choices, because obesity all obviously always isn't always just a matter of eating habits or working out, obviously. But even accommodating for health things that are we would consider more mitigating, people with thyroid problems and things like that, even accommodating for those people, there's still that economic link. So why is it that people who have less money don't eat as well? And it makes perfect sense from a deterministic view, and it makes no sense from a free will point of view. So I mean, stuff like that. It was
So it was
really.
logic. So basically, it was more information. You just like, you kind of like this sociology course gave you, all this data, and you were able to like objectively analyze it and determine from it.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. That, and I took a lot of criminal classes. That's another thing that I think is really that's why I've been focusing on criminals, because to me, if there's anybody we want to blame more, or if there's anybody that we want to blame, it's criminals. We might be fine, and we've done this for years. We might be fine excusing people with mental insanity, even though we didn't at one point. Even though we didn't, we still blamed people who had mental conditions. When we finally classified it as a mental condition, we stopped blaming them. Uh, but the people that we want to blame the most, I think, are criminals. And so if we can focus on them, so my sociology classes, a lot of them are geared towards criminals. And this is my challenge to any free willist. I tell them to like watch a documentary about the just who they hate the most, who they revile, who they think the worst serial killer or mass murderer or even corrupt dictators and all that. Pick any one of them and learn about their life. And if there's any confusion by the end of that, how they ended up the way they did, you did not watch the film. Like you just simply like if you look at someone like the Butcher of Rostov, that's was it Andre Chikatilo? Yeah, Andre Chikatilo. He was known for having murdered a bunch of women and eaten their insides. And you look at that and you're just like, this guy he's evil. But then when you find out that this guy watched his mother raped by Nazi soldiers and watched his brother eaten alive, it's just kind of like I've never experienced any of those things. Could those have anything to do with what happened to him later? And you're naive to say no.
I think the problem is people don't want to see that about
Yeah,
each other.
Well, yeah, I mean, to see certain things or to learn about some of these things, like about crime and stuff, and what you were just mentioning, Quaid, well, yeah, that's unpleasant, and that's why people tend not to do it. And yet, it is through seeing the truth about that that it helps them come to the realization that, that people are caused to be the way they are by their experiences. And so this is a serious question we have to ask is, can people who cannot handle knowing about traumatic events, can they still come to understand that free will is an illusion, or does it take something shocking like that?
Well, I mean,
hmm.
hopefully, it wouldn't have to involve these heinous crimes. It could involve like a person ending up homeless, or a person just doing something very uncharacteristic. In other words, I think
Yeah,
the real key here is to just get people to focus on why people, even like with success, how did a person become successful or another person didn't? I mean, like just like
yeah.
have people key in on the causes of these things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the only reason I would recommend the more serious ones is because people are, to me, more likely to feel sorry for a homeless person than they are for a murderer. And so you'll look at the homeless person and you'll go, okay, well, I can absolve the homeless person, but I cannot absolve these other people. It's like we're constantly, as a species, we've been expanding this realm of people to blame and not blame, and we need people to blame on the outside. And when science kind of coerces us, really, when science tells us we're wrong so much that some of us have to admit it, we expand it, but we never take it all the way. And so my fear would be that if you just tell people to look at homeless people, really they'll just say, well, homeless, and that's what in fact people like Daniel Dennett have done, is they've said, well these people, we can still absolve because they're not well educated, and he's just basically expanded it without really asking, like, well, was isn't this the condition for everybody? Isn't this, aren't we lying to ourselves when we tell ourselves that this really isn't, what everybody goes through, and that everybody, just like that homeless person, has things that were pushing and pulling them throughout life to end up where they did. And
All
so,
right.
if does that make sense?
Yeah, no, Quaid, in terms of our messaging, I mean, bringing up the criminality is important because, like, we by doing this, we can bring in liberals and the Democratic Party on our side with this. In other words, like, you have a kid who commits a crime, and the Republican Party conservatives want to treat this kid like an adult, want to throw the book at him, right? For whatever
Yeah.
crime it is. Whereas, like, Democrats, liberals say, wait a minute, like, look at the kid's circumstances, look at the education he had, look at the society that he grew up in, and even to the point that, I mean, like, actually we're in a stage of history where it's like, for the last 45 years, the conservatives, Republicans had a majority on the Supreme Court. And in 1973, I believe it was, or 78, the Supreme Court actually decided, this is like, I learned this from Harris's book, that a free will is the law of the land, that people have a free will. So, like, we're now at a historic time where, hopefully soon the balance of power is going to shift toward liberal Democrats on the Supreme Court. And, to the extent that we can bring this topic, into for example, like the governor of Virginia just passed an executive order allowing like 200,000 criminals, ex-felons or whatever, to be able to vote again, right? Because this is
Hmm.
kind of like, absolution, just like being compassionate toward people who are very unfortunate. So in other words, like, one of our prongs of our strategy to get this message out there, I think, involves crime and involves getting people to understand that criminals become criminals, for because of causes that aren't in their control. And again, the great thing about this is we can have the whole Democratic Party and the whole liberal ideology as our allies in this.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that people understand this, they will realize that people need to be treated with compassion and not vilified as though they themselves are evil. And yeah, I mean, I think you're right, George. The people who are labeled as liberals, I'm still a little confused on that. They tend to be more understanding of this, that people are victims of their circumstances they don't choose. But this is just a basic fact, regardless of whether people see it or not. And what do you think would happen? Like, I know this won't happen, but like, just imagine everyone just magically got it somehow. The genie has granted your wish, and everybody understands completely just as well as we do that free will is an illusion. How would that change politics?
That's an interesting question. I guess it just
Well,
depends. No, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. Well, the first thing is, like, if you see how contentious politics is, everybody, like, Democrats blaming Republicans, Republicans blaming Democrats for everything. I mean,
Yeah.
that I think is the first thing that would go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I question whether there would even be political
Mm-hmm.
parties. What if people understood this? Like, wouldn't it all just be meetings of everybody? They wouldn't be tying themselves to like a team. Like, it's like a sports team is what it seems like. Like, we're this side, they're that side. Why can't we just all be on the same side?
Oh yeah, it's it's definitely tribal. It's completely tribal. Uh and But I agree with you guys. I think that to some extent, I mean, to me, it's like I said, Christians were at one point determinists. So some of them might, if you just said, okay, free will is an illusion, some of them might be like, oh, well, they might revert back to, well, Christ is still, you know, real and all that stuff. And so I guess there are just some people who are doomed for hell. So I don't know. I don't know if being a determinist or indeterminist or anything that's I don't know if breaking down the illusion of free will necessarily means that you at that point are all of a sudden peaceful. Because I could still think of a way, which again would be to just say, well, I guess God just made some bad people and those are the bad people. But I don't know for sure.
Well, I wonder because I think like all right in a post free will world, I think there's still going to be competition for resources. You know, people will still fight
Hmm.
over like limited resources. But I think, and I haven't done the research on this. I'm very curious to know what percentage of crimes are basically based on free will. In other words, a person commits a crime, you know, believing that the person, the victim, deserved it. That it's kind of like revenge. It's kind of like retribution. Because I imagine a lot of like crime where like the people, you know, the criminals know each other. The criminal knows the victim. You know, domestic violence, perhaps. It's like it's you know, without free will belief, I think we could like eliminate a whole, you know, host of crimes that would never have been committed, you know, if people didn't believe in free will.
Yeah, I mean, I might be idealistic or optimistic. I don't think that I am. I'm not a generally an idealistic or optimistic person. Um, but I do believe that getting rid of the illusion of free will can fix a lot of social ailments. So I don't think we wouldn't have problems anymore. I just think that a lot of the social problems would start to break down, because they're not being maintained by this misunderstanding of each other. You go in knowing that the person you're going to talk to is developed has developed their philosophy from this and that, and then so you're more willing to have a conversation with them after that, because you don't act like everything that they think that you don't believe is an affront to you as in a person. It's just the way things are.
You know, there's another side of this, guys, a sort of evolution that takes place in society, and this is really completely unconscious with us, I think, for the most part. We're not aware that this is happening. However, we know that certain beliefs or certain lacks of belief tend to make some people friendlier than others. I mean, no doubt, since I, left fundamentalist Christianity and came to stop blaming people because I know nobody really had a choice in the matter of what they are, well, that makes me become a nicer, friendly person. And people, they don't know why. Like when you know somebody, you have a group of friends that you get along with, you don't always know why those people are nice. Well, why are these people so much nicer than these people over there? And people who don't look at the underlying philosophies behind why some people are more compassionate, forgiving, and others are full of revenge and hateful, some will investigate it like we do and come to understand the belief systems, but a lot of people don't. They just hang around the nice people, ignore the not so nice people, and over time you see a shift happen in society where it becomes more popular. The nice people become more popular, if you get what I'm saying, in a
Hmm.
sense. So
Yeah.
over time, that may do it.
Absolutely. Quayd, I'm curious. All right, it's like two questions for you. One, you said that you were once fundamentalist Christian. Nick, you know, Nick and I are kind of like unique in this the collection of hosts in that we're theists. You know, I tend to like describe myself as an acutheist, you know, meaning that like, you know, the Christians, Jews, like religionists got, you know, the idea of God, you know, relatively or generally right, but uh, mistaken in certain senses. Whereas like most of the hosts are atheists. So what the first question is like, did you go from believing in God to not believing in God or having a different conception of God? And the second question is, you were talking about, you know, the possibility of reformation, just that religions reform over time, you know, the Catholic Church and all over the last 500 years. Do you believe that one of the major reasons that people have left organized religion like I did years ago is because of this free will based, you know, belief that God is going to condemn some people to like eternal suffering? Because like I can't think of a more hateful belief. I'm sorry. So like, do you think that like
Hmm.
to the extent that that religions, churches, synagogues, you know, mosques begin to teach that, you know, that there is only God's will? Because I don't think, you know, people are going to believe in God like, you know, um, that'd be a major shift for them not to whatever, but like that could like form the basis of a new reformation to bring a lot of these people who left religion back to these congregations.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, to answer your first question, No, it was a long process for me. I my I considered myself Christian probably up until the age of like 14 or 15, but that was just because my mom said the word, and so I regurgitated it whenever I was around people. But I wasn't devout at all. And then I became 16 and I had a friend who went to church all the time and he prompted me to go. And I really got into it. Like I emptied out my closet and was reading in my closet every night, and I read the Bible every day. And so we had prayer circles at our school, and I went on all the trips or whatever. Um, and 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 then at one point I got frustrated with a lot of it because of the people that were there. So they had a lot to do with it, and I ended up becoming some type of like Buddhist or something or other. And then I started working at a prison, and then I went back to Christianity, so I became Christian again. And then I met Nicole, and we were still had just started going to college and stuff, and so we were learning about different philosophies, and the free will might have something to do with it. I don't know if it really does, though. For some people, I would say yes, absolutely. The fact that free will means that you blame people turns a lot of people off to the religious aspect. To me, I take a completely philosophical, like I'm a very I don't know what you call it, but basically, I don't make conclusions outside of the scientific realm ever, and that's just where I stand on it. But I think that uh, I don't have a problem with, and I think I said this last time. People assert that religion is the highest form of evil, or it's causing all these problems, and I would disagree, and I would say that it was free will. I would say that free will is what's doing it, and that you could have some type of like, for instance, I have a friend Jay, and we've had tons of philosophical conversations on God, and he still accepts God, but he still, I mean, just as moral as I am, he still accepts free will. But I really don't think that I think he understands at this point he doesn't have a reason to, that he's just kind of sticking with it. And because of that, he ends up making a lot of choice. Whenever he makes a decision about a person, he's always looking at it through the lens of a determinist. And it's just the way it is. But he believes in God. And I think God is just the liberty that he takes. He doesn't take the position that I do, that I'm only going to make claims within the scientific, not, I go off of the scientific paradigm, so I usually shift where scientists are, and then that's it. I stop my conclusions at that point for the most part, and he doesn't, and it doesn't seem to cause any real problems at all. I think you can have somebody like Jay, or somebody who is highly religious, who still recognizes that people aren't to be blamed for their actions. It's just, again, like I said, the whole Jesus thing. That's going to be, by the way, one of the kind of things that will come up in the book that I'm writing, because I use religion a lot for my book, actually, and there's a lot of intertwining of the Christian religion in particular with the idea of messing around with free will. Um, and so I think that you can still, basically, you can reform religion in such a way that they've gotten rid of the notion of free will. When Jesus says they know not what they do, that's a perfect example. If people don't know what they're doing, like, perhaps Jesus did come out on the cross and he was, sent here by God, and God learned one of the things that God learned. Maybe if God wasn't deemed as this perfect deity, but just some type of higher deity, then he learned something through Christ, which was that we weren't to blame for what was going on. They know not what they do. So yeah, you could do it for sure, and it's probably going to happen if we can get the ball rolling. I mean, people aren't just going to give up their beliefs. I don't think. I think they're going to reform them.
Okay. It's interesting. Maybe not on this podcast, but sometime in the future, because like we've had a few email debates, and I think we've been had podcast debates, like trying to, like, I present the case that we can scientifically prove God's existence if we define God as God is ordinarily defined in dictionaries and encyclopedias. For example,
Yeah,
like, yeah, so that we should do that in the future. Hopefully with Trick and Mitch involved also. That'd be a good podcast.
I would be completely down for that.
Oh yeah, because we've done it before, but we haven't done it with Quaid, so that will be interesting. Yeah, but I would like to say that I do think that free will belief really is what is making religion harmful. I used to think it was the belief in God itself, but not so much. You know, I think it actually may be more doable for religion to reform in such a way that it accepts determinism or incompatibilism or whatever about free will, even if they retain some of their other beliefs. Because, like we've seen how they've changed attitudes about evolution and about gay people. They have changed on some of those things, and it's interesting. It seems there's only a few groups of fundamentalists out there that are very resistant to change because they're biblical literalists, so they can't change, but some do. And then we've got natural selection, basically, of which of them wins out, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hate to appeal to. I know this is fallacious in some way. I hate to appeal to morality or any of those things, but I think one of the good things about seeing free will as an illusion, or determinist or indeterminist, or however you want to label yourself, um, it's beneficial in a lot of ways for the individual and for other people, and I think that will naturally draw people. Like, we are in a society right now that wants to sympathize with people probably more than any other time. That's probably true. Maybe some people will disagree, but I really think that that's something that we can observably say, is that people want to blame less people, and they're looking for a way to do it. And this could be that philosophy. It's because you don't really have a reason to blame them. You just didn't think about it.
Yeah,
And so I think people will start to flock to that idea once it gains. That's the other problem with a lot of this, is that people, we're driven by aesthetics, and we're driven by what looks good. Um, and so, because none of us here have the resources to make a high budget online basis, that probably has a lot to do with why people don't accept the idea. And that's just an inconvenient truth.
right. I think another reason is like a lot of people, people or a certain percentage even who understand they would have a free will don't see the significance of the question of getting this right. Quaid, I don't know if you read my most recent book on Free Will, Its Refutation, Societal Cost, and Role in Climate Change Denial.
Hmm.
But there I just present, it's a brief thesis. I don't go into too much detail, but I think it's a strong argument that basically, and because basically what we're trying to do is get people to understand, wait, this is a vastly important issue to get right. And so, like in the book, I say, listen, scientists are telling people, listen, what you are doing, what your family's doing, what your friends are doing, are placing our planet's climate at such risk that in 100 years we may not have the civilization we have now. We might have a complete civilization collapse because of rising temperatures and many other kinds of you know consequences of climate change. And so here's the thing: because people believe in free will, there in psychology, there's this unconscious defense mechanism that people rely on, that they use it to protect themselves against, threats to their self-image, threats to who they
Hmm.
believe they are, and who they believe their friends and family and associates are. So, like, basically, like, it seems to make sense that people, scientists are telling people, listen, you're doing something horrible. People can't hear it because they're blaming themselves. Now, if all of a sudden, like Chandler was saying, if by some magic people like finally got that nobody has a free will, then they could listen to this message and they could say, fine, all right, I'm not going to blame myself because look, nobody has a free will. Nobody's to blame for this. But objectively, then, without having to go into denial, they could see what we're doing to the climate and then,
Hmm.
take steps to address it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
You
that's
might
a
want
good
to
point.
weave that into your novel if you can. Yeah.
Yeah, you know something, like this from my background of Christianity, like this idea of getting saved, or filled with the Holy Spirit or something like these different religious ideas, like of a massive life conversion which changes all your thinking, some kind of revolution in thinking. None of that ever happened with those kinds of things. Not really. There was no permanent change. Maybe a temporary feeling like, well, maybe something happened and then life goes on. But with this free will thing, with knowing that, whoa, everything I do has a cause. What's causing me to do this now? It's all exciting and a daily progression of massive change. And so it's almost like a profound religious experience once the illusion of free will is shattered in our lives.
Yeah, yeah, it's like that little conductor. To me, it's like that little, conductor piece that allows electricity to run through. Like you're not at all engaged in the process until you. That's why to me it was significant to have this conversation, because like I know what it's like to blame myself so heavily that I was not in problem solving mode. That's what happens when you look at yourself that way, when you kind of see yourself as you boil yourself down to, well, I make good choices and bad choices, and today I just need to make good choices, rather than asking, why am I making bad choices? And then that's when you start to not only just try to do it with your willpower, which is to me highly problematic, because people end up just trying to use their willpower and then it fails because willpower is limited. It's like a muscle. It fatigues, and then they blame themselves rather than trying to set up their life in such a way that it makes those choices easier for them,
It's
quote
interesting.
unquote choices.
Yeah, I did a little research on willpower recently, and interestingly, according to the research, the people who who believe that they can increase their willpower by, when they don't succeed at whatever they're doing, punishing themselves, actually don't succeed as well as the people who increase their willpower by being much more understanding, by saying to themselves, all right, I didn't do it, I didn't like exert as much willpower this time, but I'm not going to punish myself, and I'm going to try harder next time. So this is,
Uh-huh.
in other words, like the more effective group was essentially using the no free will ideology.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And then to answer your other question, I want to buy your book, and I think Tricks or whoever has one, I'll buy one, because I want to make my own, and I just want to see what everybody else has said so I can try to like find some niche of my own to write about.
Absolutely. And
Um,
like, with mine, I mean, there's a dollar version on Kindle, and you can download, I think, a PDF from my site, or from Chandler's site now. So
Yeah, yeah, I'll be doing that. It's I got like another week of school, so once I'm out of there, I'm gonna buy everybody's book and do my reading that I have to do and try to get that set up.
Yeah, and you know about the list of books on the causal consciousness site, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think I saw
but
those. There, I mean,
but
there's a long list, right? It's like really long.
Yeah, they're like sorted by date, I think, with the most recent ones at the top that were published.
Mhm.
So yeah, I've actually bought quite a few of those actually. A lot of them I bought Kindle editions and read through those books. So I've read
Yeah.
what a lot of different people have had to say on the topic of free will. And there's some semantic differences and differences of how they explain it, but they've all got the same idea.
yeah, and Quaid, for your work, I mean, again, I've mentioned this before. All the books out there, including our own, I mean, we go into this somewhat, but not nearly um, in enough depth. We're basically addressing the logic of why we don't have free will, whereas like we're almost completely ignoring
The
these
emotional.
motivated reasonings, these emotional ideological barriers to people understanding and accepting the logic. So to the extent that your novel can address that, that's really the holy grail. That's what hasn't yet been done, and still needs to be done.
Oh yeah, I know, I agree. It's my it's my least favorite way though. I mean, I am a huge proponent of logic and thinking about things step by step. And so while I grew up in fiction writing, and I've done it most of my life, um, one of my biggest problems is that I read more nonfiction than I read fiction. Um, and so I mean I still want to I was going to make the fiction anyway, and so I'm going to do it. And I think it's important to have that out there. And I do think that it's, in terms of numbers, it's way more motivating because people like to be entertained. They don't, unfortunately, a lot of them don't like to think about things like that. They don't want to pick up a nonfiction book. They don't want to read step by step or logic. They want to be persuaded by something else. And so I'll have the book for that, and that if it's any good at all, hopefully it will pick up steam and proliferate some of the ideologies behind free will being an illusion. But I also want something concrete out there, as well, if nothing else, just for me or the people who are in the scientific or academic community, because I'm heavily in that myself, who still need to be persuaded as well. But who knows? Like I said, I haven't read your books yet, so I don't know. You guys might have said everything, and then I could just be like, no, just go buy this book or whatever.
Yeah. Hey, here's another thing, is like, with so many good books out there, like I realized the book I did really wasn't that great by comparison. You know what I mean? Can't blame myself, obviously, but there's just no way that anybody could do a better job than Trick Slattery did. Like seriously, it's a long book, but he just goes so in depth in so many chapters. It took me like a month or 2 months to actually finish that book because I'm such a slow reader, you know.
Yeah,
But yeah, I like in-depth stuff like that. However, I will say that sometimes shorter things are less intimidating, and that's why I think like George's book that he was mentioning earlier, it's a very short book, and that's important too. Because people don't like to read things the size of a phone book.
yeah,
Right, and quite
yeah,
another thing, Harris presented the material really well,
yeah,
and that's another component. In other words, fine, you address the logic, right? But you might find the way of expressing it that resonates with people. That's another component that, again, I mean, I think we've tried to appeal to different audiences, but a more expansive appeal to a major audience, through a novel might really be what changes everything. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, this book. Like I said, I've been thinking about it for years, so I'm really excited to try to get it together because I mean, it's going to be like a trilogy type thing, so it'll be 3 books. Um, but like I said, I use religion, and to me, it's a very important part because it's actually an adaptation of some religions and their spiritual, like I said, their spirituality in it and stuff like that. So hopefully that too will get people's attention. Now, the other problem is that it could be seen as blasphemous. Um, so that's one problem with it. But I think that right now in society, hopefully, we're at a place where that's a little bit more okay, and people will watch it. Whereas if I had done something like this years ago, there's no chance. But I think
Yeah, and
people are
again,
more open to it.
you can cite history, for example, of the three Jewish sects at the time of Christ.
Hmm.
The Sadducees believed that we had complete free will in everything. The
Yeah.
Pharisees, who were the dominant sect, they believed that we only had free will in our moral decisions. Where we worked, where we lived, that was none of that was up to us. And the
Hmm.
Essenes, who the Jewish historian of the time, Josephus, described as the most pious of the Jews, the most elevated, evolved of the Jews, were the Essenes, and they rejected the free will notion altogether. They believed that everything was God's will.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
I'm gonna need you to type that up for me and send that to me because
sure, sure.
that's definitely something. That'll definitely be relevant to it. I mean, I openly use Jesus in one of the books. Like Jesus is one of the characters in my books, and so I'm kind of distorting the historical aspect, and so that will be useful. Um, there's also that old legend. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but they say that the age of 13 to 30, like Jesus wasn't. There's nothing on him basically in that time frame. Um, and there were some like rumors or legends out there that he actually went to like some Buddhist monastery or something like that, and like traveled. Obviously there's no actual evidence for that, but it's really interesting to think that. I mean, there's a lot of Buddhists out there who are determinists, who connect us to the universe. We're the universe manifesting itself very briefly in one way. We're just a perturbation of consciousness, and that's it. And there's no control or this and that. And so it'd be really interesting to have a character like Jesus exposed to some of those elements and then bring them back, and talk about them.
Sounds good.
Oh yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, we've talked about so many different things in this one episode. This always happens. We always ramble on because one thought leads to another. I mean, it's just plain so obvious that it's not up to us. We can't even stick to a plan. It's not our plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Have we covered this enough? We're, I guess, like an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think this was a good episode. We talked about some of the benefits that it's had for each of us, overcoming the illusion of free will. Plus, we learned a lot about Quaid's background this way. So overall, I think this was a good episode. So I guess I can end it now, unless there was anything else you guys wanted to add.
I'm good.
I'm
I'm
good.
good. Yep.
Okay, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, Quaid, and Wsdtime. And we've had a lot of talk about free will, but also religion and all sorts of interesting stuff. We get to know each other better all the time. So, hope you've learned something from this, or at least enjoyed it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.